everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see you all here. We have Pete and Nancy here with us. They're going to do session 2 of starting an NGO. Before we go ahead and dive in, Pete and Nancy, would you introduce yourselves for any newcomers who weren't with us in session 1?
Hello, my name is Pete. I am the COO of Whole Child International. It's a small NGO that works primarily in El Salvador, but has global ambitions, and we work in the field of child protection and child care. And I've spent the last 20 years overseas within various international NGOs, 12 of those years with Save the Children, and moved to Portland about a year ago.
And I'm Nancy Press. I'm the CEO of Child Aid, which is also a relatively small NGO, slightly under $2 million budget. We work in Guatemala and trying to address poverty through education and literacy. We work in primary schools, training teachers essentially, and providing books and a scripted curriculum. So we've been in existence for about 20 years, but really have been doing the work we're doing now for about a decade.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for being here with us today and for really being a touch point for this sort of topic that I think so many different people are interested in and are at different stages of learning about. Would you guys mind really quickly just sort of telling us what your impression was from session 1 and what you kind of took away as the key points that you shared? What did you feel were some impactful points?
Us or them?
Oh, let's start with Pete and Nancy, and then if anyone else has thoughts about what they came away with from session 1 or questions in particular that we address, maybe drop them in the chat.
I mean, Nancy, if I may, I think one of the key points, I think there's 2. One is there's really a lot that you need to think about before you start implementing activities. Really establishing your conceptual framework, doing an analysis of what's happening, who are the players, what is your value added. I think those types of questions are really important to ask before you get into the nuts and bolts of creating a nonprofit. And the other thing that we really want to emphasize, we're going to on it again, is what does success look like? Because sometimes you can really get focused on doing activities and don't take the time to take a step back and say, are we actually being successful and are we reaching our goals and how do we measure that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Pete said. I think the only thing that I would add from my own experience that I talked about a little last time is the realization of how similar an NGO is to a small business or a large business if it's a large NGO, and how people generally get into the nonprofit world loving program and loving what they can do, and then it's kind of a shock and a struggle to think about the organizational business and fundraising parts of it that are really so crucial to what you're going to do day to day.
Awesome, great. With that, I'd love to turn it over to you guys and kick into session 2.
All right, sounds good. So Nancy and I are going to do a tag team here. And feel free to jump in at any time with any questions or comments. I mean, it's a small group, so, nice and intimate. And again, I'm sure there's things that you might have questions for or comments that you will make, and we're happy to address those the best that we can. We do have an outline that we're going to follow, but there's nothing saying that we can't skip around if something, a particular topic comes up. However, because this is session 2, there's just a few things we need to make sure that we say about starting an NGO, and I'm going to start off with the first and most important one. I take that back. Not the most important one. The first one is one of the things that really defines being an NGO is being a 501c3, and that's basically you need to register, and that is the 501c3 refers to a tax code. So basically, it means that you are a nonprofit. And a lot of times that could be a church, it could be an NGO, but it means that there's certain specific activities that you can't do. But really, it's called a 501c3 because it's related to taxes. You are tax exempt. That's one of the main things. But if you're going to be an NGO, you do have to register that. That's at the most basic level, and you can register both at the national level and at the state level. If you're working internationally, you also have to register in the country that you're going to work as a nonprofit. Obviously, that's going to depend on which country that you're going to, but at the most basic level, one of the things that you're going to want to do is get registered. And that does mean that you exist. Doesn't mean you're actually doing anything yet, but it does mean that you exist as an organization. Not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it has to be said. However, one of the things that is also part of being a nonprofit is having a board of directors. Not every organizations are required to have a board. And we thought it was really worthwhile to talk about that in more detail because boards come in all sorts of flavors and sizes. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nancy.
Yeah, I'm still looking for the CEO who feels that that she has a really great relationship with her board of directors. I think actually Andrea Johnson might be one of them, partly because the board is headed by the founder of Green Empowerment, with whom she has a really terrific relationship. So that's a really good thing there, and to point out that the relationship of the CEO or ED with the board chair could be really important. I think there are two reasons that the relationship can be strained between a board and staff. One is a different sense of what the role is from each of those perspectives. So I would say that most CEOs and sort of the places like Foundation Center or any of the organizations that write about and for the nonprofit world consider one of the very most important roles of the board to be fundraising and advocacy. I read a report recently that said 70% of CEOs are dissatisfied with the fundraising that their board is doing for them. And a very small percentage of board members really see that as their role. So that is a sort of built-in conflict, because I would say that most CEOs think the most, the payback for the work that they do, that the board requires of them, is that is a way to raise money and to get the organization known. So that's kind of a misfit sort of from the beginning. Legally, a board's major responsibility, the one they must do, is fiduciary. So that is just making sure that the organization is handling its money well, working within budget. The board will approve the budget once a year with more or less oversight. And the CEO of an organization, even when that person is a founder, works for the board. And one of the board's responsibilities is hiring and firing and reviewing and pay adjustments for the CEO. For many board members, certainly in my board, I've got 13 people on my board. For many of them, that satisfies them. That's all they really want to do. And if they also raise some money, that would be fine with me. But then there are other board members that really do want to be more involved. And then the question is, sort of what do you move on to? Some people say the next stage is what might be considered an administrative or managerial board. So they're going past just looking at the budget. They really have a lot more knowledge of what's going on in the organization. They have ideas about, or at least, want to know about staffing and personnel and program growth and plans for the future, things like that. That's more satisfying, actually, for me to be able to talk to the board on that level. The third place is what's known as a generative board, where the board actually has some real hand in both strategic planning and also just thinking about what the vision is of the board. And I think that's a place where you can sometimes get what you wish for, and then you're not so happy about it, because certainly in my experience, very few boards actually know enough about what's going on in the day-to-day running, especially in an international organization, to have much to say that staff hasn't already thought of and discarded many times, you know. But if you want a board to be involved, you have to let them play a little bit in that more interesting space. So that's actually something I'm still struggling with in my own board meetings, is moving between a kind of show and tell, the staff completely runs everything, and giving the board more opportunity to opine. And it would be easier to do that if the board actually read the stuff you sent out. I noticed that Pete put in the outline, I often refer to my board as the cranky bears, because they go into hibernation for almost the entire year. And you know, I communicate with them, I send things to them, very, very little response. And then right before the board meeting, they all come out and they're at the meeting and they're awake and they're, you know, sometimes a little cranky, and then they go back into hibernation. So it can feel, especially to my staff that who's pretty overworked and overwhelmed, like, oh, another board meeting, you know, what are we going to do? So I have to say something positive. I realize I've just been ragging on boards for 10 minutes. If you have a good board chair, that can be really helpful. And I think one of the reasons that I have had difficulty, so this would be a warning, is even though we have a pretty good board member agreement describing the organization and describing what the roles of the board are and what the management roles of the management are, unless you really onboard people very carefully and make sure that they buy onto that board member agreement, you wind up in the place that I'm at, which is not the best place. So I am trying to change my board right now to a board that's more involved and really takes on what the board member agreement is. I think you should have a board member agreement. I'd be happy to share ours. I'm sure Pete has something similar. And I guess one other thing I want to add is that it is a usual arc of board development and NGO development, that if you start small, I think you wind up with some of the stresses that I'm going through now, because you sort of have to beg people to be on your board at that point. And you wind up with boards that are like friends of Rick and Nancy. All right, my husband and I started Child Aid. So, you know, it's a very different relationship. It's not particularly a professional board yet at that point. And then as you get larger, you sort of are trying to move toward a fundraising and more managerial board. And that sometimes means adding people and kind of hoping that your old good friends will realize that they really don't want to be on your board anymore. But I think that's a transition that people go through. Pete, do you have a different perspective on that?
I mean, I would add a couple comments. I mean, boards are, in theory, they're meant to make sure that the executive director, because the executive director reports to the board. The reality is, a lot of times when you're the founder, you ask people to be on your board. So even though you're the executive director or you're the founder, it's not, you're not reporting to them. It's more of you're working with them. But Nancy's point is absolutely correct. You usually start out with, your friends and people you know, and then you're trying to professionalize it over the course of time. But fundraising is a really key point, like as Nancy said, about for the board, advocacy and visibility, because you're trying to find people who have relationships with the community and the people you're going to want to work with and people you're going to have contacts with. They're supposed to help the organization be more visible, have a greater impact. But it's voluntary. Boards, people are not paid to be on a board, so you're balancing the amount of work that you want them to do versus what you can legitimately ask them to do. Melissa, to your point, is that are there legal requirements for the size of a board? The short answer is I don't know.
I don't think so.
The longer answer is I've never seen a board smaller than 3 people. And usually one of those people is also the executive director or the CEO. But you want to have enough people who are going to provide enough different opinions and support. But I don't think there's a legal requirement. I do know, because Whole Child we've got a Whole Child International, there's also a Whole Child UK. I do know in the UK side, for example, and this is probably not that relevant, at least 3 of the board members have to be from the UK. It can't be people from outside of the UK. You could have a 10-member board, but at least 3 need to be British.
Yeah, there's also some difference depending on what kind of 501c3 you are. We are, I don't remember the numbers now, but it's a public benefit charity. And one of the things that there's certain requirements. It gives you more freedom in some ways, but some of the requirements are that you have to have a disinterested board, which means I think no more than 40% of board members can be related to each other. That a certain amount of your money has to come from a multiple set of donors. There are also ways to be 501c3s that have a slightly lower, more casual level of requirements. So that's something worth looking into too.
The reason we wanted to mention the board and went into this level of detail is A, it's a legal requirement, but boards have the potential to be very helpful or not so helpful. So it's a lot of times when you're starting a nonprofit, you overlook the importance of a board. And so our suggestion, or our, based on our experience, is getting the right people involved at the beginning is going to make a really big difference, and finding people who are going to be able to make that commitment, particularly those beginning stages. And having a couple people who are not really close friends might actually help, because it'll be a little bit more objective and a little bit more distant. Are there any questions about that? Anything else?
I have a quick question. It makes me wonder, if you're starting out, you're brand new, and you're pitching this idea to try to gather board members, and you're just not finding much interest. Is that sort of a good litmus test for whether or not your business has the right network yet? Or I don't know. What do you think about
that? I think that has to go back to sort of the first session, which is, what do we do? Why do we do it? What's our value added? How are we different? If you can't articulate that, and if you can't generate a lot of interest, and I think it does make you question if you're really offering something that people are going to want. On the other hand, it could be any number of reasons. It could be people don't have the time, or it's just not their core interest, or they don't feel comfortable because maybe they don't have the skill. A lot of people, quite honestly, are turned off from the idea of having to fundraise. A lot of people say, I want to support your mission, but I don't want to fundraise for you.
Totally. Which is one of the reasons that I try to talk to board members about advocacy and increasing visibility rather than fundraising. And now that we're a more professional organization, you could say, you don't have to ever ask your friends for money. But if there's something you might be interested in, someone who might be interested in child aid, let me know who they are, see if we can, start a conversation. I have had more experience with the opposite problem, is that it's not all that hard to get people to join your board, but when they are friends or friends of friends, and you're small and you're starting out, the commitment I have found may often be to the person who's starting, or people who are starting the organization, rather than to the mission. And as you become a larger, or even if you start, in a better place, but as you grow and become professional, it's harder to find people who don't just think that it's a cool thing that they're part of a board, or a cool thing that the founders are trying to do something to help the world, but really understand that this is an organization trying to make a difference. And it has, again, all the same problems that any growing business has. My board chair actually said to me once, when I was talking about, and he and my husband went to the same very progressive Catholic church, so which is relevant. But when I was talking to him about growth and growth strategies, he said, Nancy, if you died right now and went to heaven and met St. Peter at the pearly gates, you've done enough already to get into heaven, And I thought, well, that's very nice, Bernie. But I'm not trying to get into heaven. I'm trying to run an organization. And yeah, so to get that sense of a professional organization, I think, is more of a challenge than to get people to want to help you out with this great idea you have.
We had another question coming in from Tim. His question is, Could you guys speak a little bit to ideas around diversity on boards? What are some benchmarks, how to get there, and all forms of diversity that should be considered when you're building your board?
Mm.
I mean, there's a lot of nuance in that question. I mean, I'd say the most important thing, even before you get to diversity, is are you finding people who are genuinely interested in the mission of the organization? Are these people who can help you out? And diversity in terms of the board can mean a lot of different things. It can be diversity of experience. It can be diversity of technical skills. It can be diversity in context. Ideally, you want to have people on the board who reflect the interest of the organization and like the target beneficiaries and your clients, people who are going to bring some value added, who understand the topics that you're trying to address. So I wouldn't limit it to, it's like ethnic diversity. It can be age, it could be gender, it could be professional background. I mean, I know in the case of Whole Child, for example, we've got like a neuroscientist, because we do a lot of work on, we're starting to do more work on cognitive development in children. So we wanted somebody who had some technical skills there. Now she just happens to be a Hispanic woman. So I mean, that sort of checks all the boxes, but that's not why we weren't interested in having on the board because she was a woman. We were interested because of her technical expertise. So we wanted somebody who could help us with this course that we're offering. But I think I would say more important than the board diversity is your staff diversity, because those are the people who are going to be working more directly with your end users or your clients or your beneficiaries. So I think it's important, but I would widen the scope when we talk about diversity that way. I don't know if that accurately or adequately answers your question.
Yeah, I agree with Pete, and his answer, which seems just completely logical to me, is a little bit on the edge of being daring at this very moment, because I belong to a variety of organizations, and they're all doing diversity training, and it has come to mean a particular thing. I agree. If you're putting together a board from Portland, it's not the easiest place to drum up a lot of diversity in terms of race, ethnicity. My board really is overly weighted toward older white guys, probably because a lot of them are my husband's friends, and he is now, sadly, an older white guy. Now our staff, we work in Guatemala, our staff is 95% or more Guatemalan. Most of them are indigenous Guatemalans. And so I feel like we sort of checked a lot of diversity boxes there, including our country director. I would love to get more Guatemalans on our board. We only have one, from a perspective, angle, rather than a check the box diversity angle. But it is, Guatemala doesn't have the same, norms, cultural norms of serving on boards. And also you're asking somebody to be on a board in another country. And even though we would pay that person's expenses, it has not been easy. There are a lot of great candidates who thought about it and said no. Anyway, I just to say that I agree with Pete. There are a lot of lenses through which to look for diversity, and I don't, I think it's an important thing to think about, but I don't really agree with the check the box diversity approach.
I see Melissa added a comment that goes with just what we're saying right now. Melissa, do you want me to go ahead and read that?
Oh, thanks. I can say it. I just didn't want to interrupt. I think both of you are like exactly right that there's so many different ways to think about diversity and board and staff makeup, but it is disappointing to me when I submit grants for the nonprofit I work for now that so many foundations do just look for box checking. How many of your staff or how many of your board identify in these ways? And we talk in my organization, like they don't even care if they're the same people of color every year. Like you could work for an organization where you can't keep staff of color for more than 8 months, but if you always have 3 of them, then you can put 3 in that little box and make your funders happy. So it's frustrating that that's the attitude when there's so many more areas of experience that people should be focusing on.
I mean, don't get us wrong. I mean, I think diversity is clearly important, and having perspective
Yeah.
is important. We just don't want to limit diversity to just gender or just ethnicity.
Right, right.
I think that there are things that, that a box checking won't capture, but I do think it's important more to do a little bit of, not soul searching, but kind of introspection about yourself and your organization. Are we just out of human habit selecting people to be in the organization who are like the people who are already in the organization? And could we do something to try to reach out more? But sometimes that'll work out, and sometimes it's hard to find those people. But I do really believe, considering how much nonprofits try to do with how little money and how little staff and how little resources, that the most important thing you can do to be honest to your mission is to get the very best people you can find.
So in the interest of time, I want to transition to everybody's favorite topic, which is money. Because I think we could talk about diversity. I think we could talk about the board for a very long time. There have been books written just on board development. So I mean, as you consider starting your NGO, one of the major questions is, how do I fund my activities, whether it's local or international or national? I'm going to go through a bunch of the most common ways in my experience that nonprofits will raise money. Not all of these are going to be relevant for everybody, but it's worth considering. And please, like I said, feel free to stop me if you have questions. In international work, I mean, the most common way, or one of the most common ways, is through institutional donors, and that's typically foreign governments. So if you're going to work through a grant from USAID, for example, the U.S. Agency for International Development, or DFID, which is the UK aid agency, or DFAT-D, which is Canadian, et cetera. Each country has their own. And typically what happens is they have a request for proposal, and you'll submit something that's 30 to 40 pages long. It's got a detailed budget. It has a org chart and a plan, and it's got a logical framework and a results framework. And these are very complex and very time consuming. And a lot of times people will actually hire consultants to write these proposals because they're very, very demanding. The plus side, though, is they tend to be for very large amounts, and millions of dollars, sometimes $1 million, but could be as much as $40 million. Again, this isn't typically where you start, as when you're starting out an NGO, but as you mature, that's where you're going to get a lot of your money. That's where you're going to see the major players, the major international players. More common is raising funds through individuals or high net worth individuals. And this tends to be smaller amounts of money, but there's a much faster turnaround time. Whereas with an institutional donor, it could take 6 months between when you write a proposal and when it actually gets funded. With an individual, depending on the relationship you have and how you cultivate it, maybe somebody will say, here's $1,000, and they'll give it to you in a week, and they'll just write a check. Or maybe, depending on who it is, they could say, here's $10,000 because I really believe in what you're doing, or $200. The point is, you have to go through that cultivation process. You have to identify people who are going to be interested in supporting your activities. But because they are individuals, there's a much shorter turnaround time, but they're also much lower amounts of money. So you could conceivably find 100 individuals who will give you $100, which is great, but you need to get a lot more individuals, and then you need to maintain that. And then when you have that many individuals, you typically have to have a customer relationship management or a CRM database, because you want to have all the contact information. You want to see when they donated, how much, how often. So having a CRM is important. There's something else called sponsorship. And I don't know if any of you have ever sponsored a child, where you give $30 a month to Save the Children or Plan or World Vision, or that is you're sponsoring a specific child or a specific project, but that's a monthly donation. And these are really, really good because they tend to be very long. So some people who sponsor a child typically will sponsor a child for 10 or 15 or 20 years. So you're going to get $30 a month every year for 10 or 15 years. So it's a very steady source of income. And that's really, really, having that reliable income is really important for a nonprofit. The downside is it's a lot of work because people who are giving that money are expecting something in return. It could be a letter from a child, it could be a photo, it could be a video, but it's the idea is that you're creating a relationship. So it is a more consistent type of funding, but it also is a less efficient. It costs more money to raise the money. So for example, if you write a grant, it might cost 2 cents for every dollar that you raise, whereas it could cost 15 cents for every dollar that you raise if you're doing sponsorship. And I could go into more detail about that, but I'm just trying to cover the main points here. There's also events. So a lot of times a lot of NGOs will have an annual event like a gala or a ball or a silent auction or something like that. These tend to raise a lot of visibility for the organization. They tend to raise a lot of money, which is all very good. They are also very, very labor intensive. So that's why it only happens once or maybe twice a year, because even though it looks easy, but if you have a dinner or a speaker series or whatever it is, there's a tremendous amount of effort that goes behind that, and that takes man hours or people hours. So in the case of Whole Child, for example, we had a gala a few years ago, and we raised about $500,000, which is a lot of money, but we also spent $250,000 to, between all of the work and all the man hours and everything that went into it. So we still raised money, we still got a lot of visibility, but it's a tremendous amount of effort. So annually is probably as often as you're going to want to do something like that. The other one, again, this is primarily if you're looking internationally, is multinationals. The UN has a lot of money. Again, it's a proposal process. The Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, all of them have money that's available through a proposal process. For most NGOs starting out, the best way to do that is usually to partner with a local nonprofit, and that makes them more attractive to these types of multinational donors. And the last one, which is probably where a lot of people look first, are local foundations. So I mean, in the case of Oregon, there's a community foundation, or there's personal foundations, or there's a Nike foundation, or you need to find what is it that your organization does that's going to be interesting to these foundations. There is a formal proposal process, but they tends to be a little bit less money than the institutional donors. You're not talking about millions of dollars, but the process is also a lot shorter. And they tend to focus on things that are much more local versus larger scale. So, I mean, I'm trying to go quickly to cover just some of the main points, but as you begin, as you start thinking about how am I going to raise money, how am I going to get this funded, these are some of the most common ones.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a couple of things to that. First of all, there are thousands of family foundations in the United States and around the world. A majority of them don't have websites or a formal proposal process. So you have to kind of find them and reach out to them individually. One very good place to look for that is Foundation Center Online. Costs a little bit of money, but it has a searchable and very, very useful database, because it shows you not only the foundations and what they do, but who they give to and how much money they've given to specific other organizations. So you can sort of pitch to ones that are like you, and also what areas they give in, areas of the world and areas of interest. Child Aid has gotten most of its foundation money from family foundations of one sort or another, some more formal, some are just like major donors on steroids. It's a very personal relationship with the person who runs the foundation. They don't, others have professional staff. The other thing that is not something that Child Aid can do, but I think has a lot of merit if you can do it. If there's something in your nonprofit model that will allow you to spin off something that raises money, whether there's an organization in Guatemala called Mercado Global, who raise a lot of their money for development by importing and exporting little items for sale, and they've got a website. You can buy things online. Obviously, anything that has to do with agriculture or helping people produce anything has a possibility of spinning off money that will help you sustain yourself, or even spinning off enough money to interest a venture. There's a lot of new venture capital money where people are not looking to make a lot of money, but they're rich and they want to get their investment back. And if they give money for something that may throw off a bit of a profit, that's a whole other area that's completely not usable for us. Also, individual donors. We have, I think, 4 donors who give around $100,000 a year. So the individual donor route doesn't have to be just a small donor route. And the last thing I want to say is I read an interesting article about organizations that made the jump from small to larger. And one of the things that that the survey found is that most small nonprofits use the whole range of kinds of donations they can get. And as they get larger, they seem to find what works best for them. So sponsorship, organizations may wind up doing that. That's, the bulk of the money they get. Organizations that have some special way to do events. There's an organization called Pencils of Promise that does one fundraiser a year, but the people who started it work for Bain Capital. And so they can hold one event in Manhattan and get the entire hedge fund community to come to that event, and that basically funds them for the year. So, they're all different kinds of models.
I would ask the participants, what they're looking at. I mean, this is typically the issue that people have the most questions around, like, how do I actually fund my my organization? How do I get started? I'd be curious to see what your experience has been up to this point, if this is something you've tried.
Well, I will find out tomorrow if I got my first grant from the Regional Arts and Culture Council. And this was funding I was able to apply for because they give funding to individual artists, and you don't have to be a registered 501c3 yet. So, and it's a $3,000 grant that I'm hoping will fund some of the community engagement and research going into whether, to determine how I will launch this next phase. So I've had some experience with that. I work as a grant writer for an established organization, Children's Institute here in Portland. So I have experience writing grants and doing individual donor foundation funding through them, but it does seem like a different challenge when you're just starting out. That, like, funding to figure out how to do the thing that you want to do before you've registered to do the thing that you want to do seems like the really tricky first stage.
Yeah. I mean, that's why, like, getting registered and sort of doing the administrative part and existing as an organization sometimes really helps, because then you exist as an organization. It's not always necessary, but it does help. But I mean, I would say that proposals and foundations are probably the most common way that people start. So I mean, what you're doing sounds very, very familiar. Where you just, and then thing is, once you get money, it's very much a catch-22. It takes money to get money, and then once you have money, once you reach scale, it's easier to make or bring in money once you've already had a few proposals accepted, because then you're a known entity and you've established yourself, and there's a level of trust, and you can point to your experience. But it's like, how do I get experience if I don't have experience? So it's one of the things that I've done in Whole Child, which I found very useful, is I've written a lot of what I call them funding briefs, which are just one-page summaries of things that I want to raise money for. So that the idea is clearly articulated well before an opportunity arises, because sometimes you might come across an opportunity that you weren't looking for, and you want to have something that's already written. So you don't want to have to start thinking about, how am I going to articulate my idea? It's already articulated, and then you just have to adapt it to the opportunity when an opportunity comes. I'd be happy to talk about that at length, because that's something I spend a lot of time doing. But I found that to be very, very useful, and it saves a lot of time, and it's more proactive rather than waiting for an opportunity to show up.
We have another response to that came in. Tim says, some can be started as an initiative within a larger nonprofit, and it might be that the CEO could do a proposal out to a partner or a fiscal sponsor. Thoughts on that?
I mean, there's all sorts of, actually Nancy and I were just talking about that. I mean, there's ways to be sort of like I know of a few organizations that were created through joint projects. So in Bolivia, for example, there's an organization called Procosi, which was actually a project that two NGOs were working on together, and because it was successful, it actually spun off and became its own organization. So that is certainly possible. And I think working as partners gives you a lot of opportunities that you might not have working individually. I don't have direct experience myself. I know that it has happened though. I don't know, Nancy, is there something you wanted to?
No, I think that would be great. It isn't something that's in my experience either. But the thing that I keep thinking about is, as people are asking questions, especially you, Melissa, is it's really nice to have some seed money to get started. You know, it's really hard to sort of bootstrap yourself, so, you know, really, really completely. And we were lucky enough to have a little bit of that. I mean, not a lot. We the very first project we did, we had $10,000. So I'd say it's money or time. Maybe that's what I would say. If you have more money to start with, you can sort of start bigger and grow bigger. If you really are bootstrapping, it's a long process to get to a point where you even have enough stability to start hiring staff. Yeah. So that's.
I mean, that really is sort of the big question: is how do I get money? how do I make this happen?
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add to that, and it feeds a little bit into the next topic that Pete is going to discuss about administrative infrastructure, is when you get a little bigger and you are spending money to make money, like with marketing of one's and fundraising of one sort or another, you then run into a very old mindset, I think, in a lot of funders, which is an expectation that because you're a nonprofit, it means that you spend nothing on running your business and everything on your recipients. So I continue to have discussions with some foundation funders who, you know, every year are looking, did I fall below the, I don't know, 80% or 82% on program that they think is important. And while I completely understand the problem about organizations that spend far too much on their administrative overhead, which probably isn't anybody on this call, the fact is there are points of expansion where you need to put some money into growing the organization, and it may have an impact on your percentage of overhead to program. But that's a constant dance. That's also a real problem, or a real finessing issue.
So, I mean, in the interest of time, we're going to jump to the next session or section. But so, you know, okay, you've got your board, you've established as a 501c3, you've written a couple of proposals, or you've got some funders. And so you're like, okay, now what do I do? And I think one of the things that's really overlooked often is what I call is the administrative infrastructure. And what do I mean by that? So that's basically human resources, that's finance, that's communications and marketing, it's your grant management, it's all the stuff that happens behind the scene that needs to be in place to operate effectively and legally. So when you're one or two or three people, these aren't major issues, but what I've definitely learned through my experience is that getting the right systems in place early makes changing those systems as you grow and evolve easier as you move on. So a lot of times you'll have just a couple people in an office and say, oh, we don't need to worry about, you know, purchase orders or purchase requests because it's just the two of us. It's like, actually you're establishing a culture where as you get bigger or more complex, having those things in place just makes everything a lot easier. What I wanted to mention specifically is every organization should have a mission, should articulate what you're trying to accomplish, and then, but the structure needs to support that. So you don't want to have multiple people and then like, okay, what do you do? Why are you here? What is your role? You should be able to understand everybody has a place in the organization. And that's not to say that there's a one size fits all and one structure is applicable to everything, but whatever structure you have should exist to support the mission. And what I've seen in larger organizations is, you know, you might get a lot of money because of one project and you've got a bunch of staff and you say, oh, now we need to find something to support these staff. That's not the way you want to approach things. You want to say, this is what we want to do, and this is the staff that we need to get it done. So really making sure that your staffing and your structure support your mission rather than the other way around. When you're first starting out, that's not a huge issue, but it's something that's important to have in your mind as you go forward. The other thing is certain key processes. Whether you're talking about procurement or you're talking about per diem or you're talking about IT, you know, one of the things that I ran into in Whole Child, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time because there was just 4 of us in the office, but we all had 4 different computers. You know, one had a Dell, one had HP, one had an Apple, you know, and it got really difficult because everybody had different software and it didn't talk to each other. And then like, oh, I can't print on this computer or on this printer. So taking the time to really say, do I have the right software? Do I have the right equipment? You know, and it can be, you know, phones, computers, printers, whatever it may be, but make sure that stuff is standardized and agreed upon is really important. And one of the things that I always say is it's the small things that always get in the way. And I always use the example of per diem as an example. Let's say you go someplace and you say, you know, I need to go to Salem. And I'm down there and I'm trying to meet a donor and I took him or her to lunch and the whole thing plus gas, I should be reimbursed and the whole thing costs, you know, $45, you know, making this up. And you say, okay, I want the organization to pay me back because it was official business, but then there's no per diem policy. And you're like, well, how do we do this? And how do I get paid back? And where do I give my bank information? And before you know it, you spent 4 hours trying to get your $45 back. And when you're one person or 2 people, like, okay, maybe, you know what, we can work around that. But as you get bigger, that poor use of time and not having that right policy in place really has a big financial and time impact. So it's really important just to get, it's those daily operational details, which are really important. I'm sure, you know, like if you lose your email password and then it takes you 2 hours to figure out how to get it back because somebody's the administrator and you don't know who it is and he's out. These are the types of things that are really impede small organizations from moving forward. If you're looking internationally, and there's a couple of things that come up and I don't think it's super relevant for right now, but I'm going to mention it, is there's a role of national staff versus international staff. Like in the case of Whole Child, for example, we have about 20 staff in El Salvador, but we have 2 international staff. I mean, we very deliberately said we want to have as few international staff as possible. And the 2 that we have is because they bring a specific skill set that we couldn't find in El Salvador. So it's not appropriate, for lack of a better word, to have a huge amount of international staff going into another country because most times you're going to find the technical skills that you need there. And the same could be said even when you're working nationally. In an ideal world, you want to have people who are from the community that you're working in. It generates more buy-in. They're attached to the project. It's closer to home, so and they have more sway and more contacts locally. The other thing, just very briefly, as we're talking again about the administrative infrastructure, as you start getting more staff, it's really important that you're aware of labor laws. And this changes, even if you're in Oregon and you go into Washington or into California, the labor laws change from state to state, and they certainly change from country to country. So before you have any sort of expansion, or if you're working remotely, like, oh, I'm in Oregon, but so-and-so's in Nevada, you need to make sure that you're following the labor laws. The other thing is just any staff you have should have a job description. I know that sounds really basic, but when you're hiring somebody, you're hiring them to do a specific job. So making sure that job description is clear and you have indicators of success is really important. So I just saw this question here. When does it make more sense to operate with part-time staff and consultants versus full-time employees? That's a very good question. There's pros and cons to both. And I think a lot of it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And Nancy, please jump in if I miss anything here. I tend to use consultants when I'm looking for a short-term deliverable. When I need a specific product in a specific amount of time, and then I'm not going to need something after that, that's when I use a consultant. One of the mistakes that I have seen is say, you know, I need somebody to do this activity, so we're going to hire somebody full time, and then that activity is done, and then you don't know what to do with that person. So when I think you need to ask yourself, what do I really need from this person? Is this ongoing? Is it a one-time thing? Obviously, full-time employees are much more expensive because then you start covering benefits, the salary is higher, but then also, excuse me, but then the expectations are a lot higher. If you hire somebody full-time, you expect more from them, you can demand more from them as a full-time employee. As a part-time employee, again, they're cheaper. You may or may not have to pay benefits depending on how many hours a week that they're working. But you're not going to get the same level of commitment. They're going to have competing priorities coming from elsewhere. So it really depends on what your ultimate goal is.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The only thing that I would add is, given constraints on money, one of the things that I've sort of fallen into doing that's worked really well is I can afford a higher level of person as a consultant than I could. It's not that they're cheaper, it's that I'm needing them for less time, and the benefits. And so I have some very high level consultants whom I could not possibly employ full time in terms of what they cost. So I agree with Pete, especially if it is a time limited project. Consultant may make sense, but I also have somebody who's doing grant writing and they're working fairly steadily 2 days a week. I pay for 2 days of their time, and they are at just a level of excellence and experience that they would be unaffordable as a full-time employee. So,
any other questions about staffing, or I'll take that as a no. The only other thing that I really wanted to add is when you start talking about money, there's a couple ways of dealing with finances and accounting. In the case of Whole Child, for example, we outsource all of our accounting. We do not have an accountant on staff. So we actually have a company, there's about 2 or 3 people, and they'll give us a couple hours a week to do what we need to do, and they'll generate financial reports each month. And I can call them when I need to, but they're not full-time. And that's specifically because, to Nancy's point, we can afford that, and it gives us a level of support that we need where we don't need a full-time accountant because we're small enough. But they also help us with, like I said, the financial reports every month, but also with our budgeting. So it's nice to have an objective pair of eyes and say, listen, here's my 2021 budget. You know, you are the experts. Is there anything that I've missed? And they can talk about things like depreciation or, you know, audits and stuff like that, where I don't have the technical expertise. So we're paying them to give us that expertise, but it's in more as on an as needed basis. Nancy, I know you want to talk about communications and.
yeah, just a little bit. And yeah, I'm in the embarrassing situation where, going back to funding, somebody from World Vision, which is an organization about, I don't know, 1,000 times larger than Child Aid, wants to talk to me about a possible, going in with them on a possible USAID grant at 1. So I could not tell them, I preferred not to put them off. So I'm going to hop off exactly at 1. But communications, advocacy, and marketing. Yeah, we actually did hire a consulting firm to do a rebranding of Child Aid. about 3 or so years ago to really get the look of our organization the way we wanted it, and also to be more attuned to what our mission really was. And we that has been really, really, I was going to say successful. It's been really, really wonderful in terms of increasing the look and the quality and the kind of communications we do. I frequently say to my staff, what we're doing is we're creating a more and more beautiful tree in the forest. But how do you get people to walk past the tree and see it? And to me, that's what, that's the communications and marketing piece. And it's difficult. It's a noisy space. A lot of people are looking, are competing with you for the eye and the attention of people when you're a small organization. So we do a fair amount of social media, kind of because you have to. But that is not a direct, money maker. It's just a way to get yourself known more. We have a loyal set of donors, but expanding that donor base is a real issue. And I would say that's the main thing your communications and advocacy and marketing are trying to do is expand the base of people who know about you and care about you. It is one of the things that we pay the most money for. I mean, there are 3 people on staff out of a staff of 5 who are basically doing communications, marketing, and fundraising, and that's a lot. But it's I don't know any. I wish I had some magic bullet. I actually don't even know why I put myself on the agenda to talk about this, because it's a constant source of problems. Our communications, our marketing gets better and better, but getting more people to know about an organization, an international organization working in Guatemala that's located in Portland, is tough. It's just tough. Pete, do you have any wisdom?
I mean, I would say that I spend a lot of time on social media myself, and I don't particularly enjoy it because I don't think that's not how I communicate best. But that's every time I talk to somebody, they ask me, what do you have on Twitter? Where's your Facebook? LinkedIn. So it's just we have a communications person we hired because out of necessity we need somebody who could get our message out that way, because it's visibility, and if people don't know you exist, then they're going to be less likely to either support you financially or care about your mission in general. It's just one of those things that you have to do, and short, concise, and consistent communication is fundamental.
I do think that there's a magic that happens, although it can take a while, and it's the magic of networking. If somebody mentions you to somebody else, and that somebody else who can say, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that organization before," your your brand has just gotten a tremendous boost, even if it's just 2 or 3 people who have heard of you. So, and that has a synergy, and it builds on itself. But it can take a long time to get to that point.
And with that, I couldn't not segue into a little closing statement about GlobalPDX, as we are a network. But before I do that, thank you so much, Nancy and Pete.
Thank you.
I know we have to hop off right at 1 for you, so I'll keep it short, but
Thank
we
you.
so appreciate your expertise being here.
Thank
And
you.
as everyone knows, you can access our member portal, which has information and resources that Pete and Nancy referenced both in session 1 and in session 2. It also has connections to their LinkedIn profiles. So if you did want to continue the conversation, both Pete and Nancy can connect with you that way. GlobalPDX is Oregon's hub for global change makers. We're going to be transitioning back into in-person events after this summer, kicked off with our August 29th member appreciation event, which everyone is invited to down in Salem. We're also so excited to have programs running all the time that can help with your connectivity, strengthening that network, supporting your communications and getting you new visibility and eyes on the projects you're doing, and also connecting you in with other people who are at the same stage of development that you are. So please consider becoming a GlobalPDX member, and we'll see you at the next event. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.